Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, we are discussing ICE. That stands for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This is a pretty difficult topic because immigration enforcement involves real national concerns, border control, public safety, trafficking, customs violations, criminal networks, and national security, a whole bevy of things.
But it also involves civil liberties, due process, family separation, wrongful detention, and the growing question of whether immigration enforcement has become too aggressive, too secretive, or too loosely supervised.
And for younger people like myself, this is not just a policy debate. No, it's something that we see in videos, on social media, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, and in conversations with classmates whose families may be directly affected by this. When young people see masked agents, unmarked vehicles, raids, or stories about people detained by mistake, the question becomes very, very basic. Can the government do this to anyone? And if it can, who stops it?
Well, that is exactly the democratic question. Our purpose today is not to make a blanket statement that every ICE agent is abusive or that immigration law should not be enforced. That would be way too simple.
And it would also be unfair. But we do want to ask a serious question. What happens when a federal enforcement agency gains more power, moves faster, wears masks, reduces transparency, and operates in ways the courts increasingly challenge?
Well, from a psychological standpoint, government power is not experienced only as law. It is experienced emotionally as safety, fear, trust, uncertainty, or intimidation.
And historically, democracies do not usually lose rights all at once. Democratic rights often deteriorate gradually through emergency language, expanded enforcement, weakened oversight, normalized secrecy, and public acceptance of exceptional measures.
So, this episode is about ICE, but it is also about something bigger: how a democracy handles power when the people most affected may have the least political voice.
That's correct, Chandler. Now, Dr. Deneen, let's start at the beginning. When did ICE begin?
ICE was created under President George W. Bush in 2003 after the Homeland Security Act of 2002. That law followed the September 11th attacks and reorganized the federal government around Homeland Security. ICE was formed by merging parts of the old Immigration and Naturalization Service, known as INS, with parts of the United States Customs Service. Its mission became enforcing federal laws involving border control, customs, trade, and immigration.
So, ICE did not start as one old agency that had always existed. It was a post 9/11 creation, correct?
Exactly, Dr. Weaver. It was born in the atmosphere of national security. The idea was that immigration enforcement, customs enforcement, terrorism prevention, trafficking investigations, and cross border crime should be brought together under a new Homeland Security framework.
And Dr. Deneen, that really does matter because us younger people often today think that ICE has always existed in its current form, but it's actually a relatively new agency shaped by the politics and fear after 9/11.
Well put, Chandler. And ICE itself has two major public facing enforcement branches that people often kind of get confused and twisted together.
Yes, one is enforcement and removal operations, ERO. That is the part most associated with arrests, detention, and deportation. The other is Homeland Security Investigations, HSI. which investigates crimes such as trafficking, smuggling, financial crimes, cybercrime, customs violations, and transnational criminal activity.
So when people say ICE, they may be talking about very different parts of the same agency.
That distinction matters, Dr. Weaver, but most public controversy centers on ERO, the enforcement and deportation side.
And online, that distinction often disappears. People see ICE and think, oh, raids, detention, deportation, and fear. That public image becomes part of the agency's legitimacy problem.
Legitimacy problem, indeed.
Yes, sir.
The official reason for ICE was security.
Yes, after 9/11, there was a belief that separate agencies were not communicating effectively. The federal government wanted to combine information, enforcement, immigration records, customs investigations, and border related intelligence.
So ICE was not created only to deport people.
That's correct. It was created as part of a much larger Homeland Security project. But over time, especially in public debate, ICE has become associated most strongly with immigration arrests, detention centers, deportation flights, workplace raids, and disputes over whether people are being targeted fairly.
And Dr. Deneen, that shift is very important. An agency can be created for broad security reasons, but then become known publicly for one of its most coercive functions.
Yes, and that is where the agency becomes controversial. An agency created under the language of national security now operates deeply inside ordinary American life at workplaces, courthouses, neighborhoods, schools, homes, and sometimes traffic stops. It sounds like what you were saying a little bit earlier, Chandler.
Yes, sir.
Which means the question is not only should the law be enforced, the question is how is the law enforced, against whom, with what evidence, and under what limits.
With what evidence? Yes. That question is essential in a constitutional democracy. The power to enforce law must always be balanced by the right to due process, the right to challenge government action, and the expectation that power is visible, reviewable, and accountable.
Absolutely, Dr. Weaver, because if government power becomes invisible, fast, and difficult to challenge, people they don't experience it as democracy. They experience it as control.
Authoritarianism.
Yep.
So let's move to training. Specifically, has ICE training changed?
Yes, it has, Dr. Weaver. Recent reporting indicates that ICE's basic training was shortened during the recent hiring surge. The Washington Post reported that records showed ICE removed about 240 hours, more than 40% from its basic training program. The cuts reportedly included hands-on scenarios, firearms training, fitness training, practical evaluations, and classroom instruction on legal authority. ICE denied that the overall quality was reduced and said recruits receive on-the-job training.
Yeah, right. That is important. Legal authority is not a minor subject. If an agent does not understand when a warrant is required, when force is justified, or what rights a person has, mistakes can become constitutional violations.
And for people my age, and may I also say, people of my color, of black people, this is one of the scariest parts here. If an officer makes a mistake, the government may call it an error. But for the person detained, it can mean losing a job. It can mean missing school, being separated from family, or being sent somewhere dangerous and even deadly in some cases.
And the problem becomes more serious when the agency is expanding quickly. A slow growing agency can mentor new officers carefully, but if an agency is trying to double its force, train people quickly, and push them too fast into high pressure street operations, the risk of error rises.
The Post also reported that before the changes, basic training was a 72-day program, which actually was described by officials in conflicting ways as either 47, 42, or 56 days. That's a pretty big difference. And then when you take on top of that, reducing the training time by 40%, guess what? You have pretty untrained people. It's also reported that recruits with prior law enforcement experience may now take an online course rather than going through the same academy track as recruits without that background.
Dr. Weaver, that raises a difficult question. Does prior law enforcement experience always translate well into immigration enforcement?
No, not even close. Not necessarily at all. Immigration enforcement has its own legal rules, civil procedures, administrative warrants, removal orders, asylum issues, bond hearings, and constitutional limits. It's a complex issue that needs training.
And unlike a typical local police case, immigration enforcement may involve people who are not accused of ordinary crimes. Many are accused of civil immigration violations. That makes training in legal authority even more important, not less.
And that is something that people miss. The public often hears illegal and assumes criminal, but immigration law can involve civil violations, asylum claims, paperwork issues, expired status, or complicated legal proceedings.
Exactly. In psychology, we would call that a category error with social consequences. If the public is encouraged to view every undocumented person as a dangerous criminal, then harsher enforcement becomes easier to justify emotionally.
And historically, the erosion of rights often begins with language. Governments narrow public empathy by defining certain groups as threats rather than people with legal claims, families, histories, and most important of all, rights.
Yes. Okay, now we should address a claim that is often made that some people join ICE because they could not get accepted by police departments or the military.
Now, we need to be careful here. I haven't found strong evidence proving that ICE systematically recruits people rejected by the police departments or the military. That would be an unfair and too broad a claim.
Oh, yeah. I don't think that ICE goes after people in that regard, but those people are enticed for other reasons. So there is evidence of concern about rushed hiring and questionable qualifications. It has also been reported that people not accepted by the military or police were often hired by ICE and given the grab this one $50,000 bonus they offered. Now, this does need some verification, and people can, review it themselves. There's AP and other investigations that they can check out.
$50,000 is a lot of money. An Associated Press investigation reported that during a massive hiring push, some new ICE officers began work before completing background checks, and some had histories involving financial problems, multiple short term law enforcement jobs, lawsuits, misconduct allegations, or incomplete police training. AP reported that ICE said most new hires are police or military veterans, but AP also found cases that raised concerns about whether the vetting process was strong enough.
Now, Dr. Deneen, I have to say, that really does sound like a recipe for public distrust right there. Hmm. If the government is giving people arrest power before completing background checks, then people will naturally ask whether the system is protecting the public or protecting the agency.
Chandler, it sounds like a recipe for incompetence.
I think it does too, Dr. Weaver.
Yeah. So the fair wording is this: we should not say ICE is filled with police rejects. Okay. That is not proven.
But we can say published investigations have found that rapid hiring has allowed some questionable candidates into the pipeline, including people with prior law enforcement instability or incomplete police academy experience.
And when an agency has the power to detain people without court involvement, enter homes without warrants, use force from a person that is disguised, and help remove people from the country, weak vetting is not a small administrative flaw. It's a real problem.
It's a public safety issue.
Not only that, Dr. Zanine, it's a democratic rights issue. The states should not lower standards for people who are given power over vulnerable populations.
That is correct. One of the most visible changes is agents wearing masks or face coverings. Now, oftentimes the policing activities of ICE has been compared to things that happened in Nazi Germany. Even those people didn't wear masks. So why has this become such a major issue here?
Images of masked ICE agents have become one of the most defining symbols of recent immigration enforcement. Reuters reported that mask and balaclava wearing agents during raids in Los Angeles and other cities ignited a debate over whether agents were protecting themselves from harassment or using intimidation tactics themselves.
And AP reported that in recent U.S. memory, no American policing operation has so consistently masked thousands of officers from the public. DHS says masking protects employees from online harassment, while critics say it reduces accountability and damages trust.
Now, for younger people, the image is immediate. A masked person with a weapon does not look like accountable law enforcement. Not at all. No, it looks like fear. It looks like something right out of an authoritarian state, even if the person is legally authorized.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we'll get into that more in a minute here too, but the mask issue is powerful because it changes how law enforcement is perceived by the public. A uniformed officer with a visible name or badge is one thing. A masked person in tactical gear, perhaps in an unmarked vehicle, is really quite different.
And that has consequences. People may not know whether they are dealing with real federal agents, local police, private security, or wannabe impersonators.
Yeah, exactly. Some states tried to restrict masks or required visible identification. California passed down laws aimed at identification and masking, but federal courts blocked at least some of those attempts, partly because states generally cannot regulate how federal agents perform federal operations.
So even if states are worried about public safety and impersonation, the constitutional question becomes complicated.
But the social question is still quite simple, Dr. Tanine. If people cannot identify who is arresting them, trust declines. Think about this all too frequent occurrence. Someone or several persons without any identification, wearing masks, disguising them, come up to you with a gun drawn, ordering you to come down with them or lie down. Now, how confident would you be about their legitimacy? Huh?
I, I wouldn't. I'd be scared to death.
Well, I'm scared to death just thinking about it, you guys, because if you're young, brown, or an immigrant, or just simply unsure of your rights, that moment is quite terrifying. It's not just it's not an abstract legal debate. It is the body going into fear mode, freeze, comply, panic, or run.
You know, Chandler, that's a critical psychological point that you bring up. Fear changes decision making. When people are confronted by armed, masked agents, they may not be able to calmly assess legality, ask for a warrant, or remember their rights. And besides, even if they asked for a warrant, it's not going to be provided for them because they don't have to have them.
And in a democratic societies, law enforcement should not depend on terror. It should depend on lawful authority, visible accountability, and the confidence of the public.
Now we need to talk about illegal or unsupported actions. This is where wording matters and where we could get into some problems. And I will just tell our listeners, if the black sedan comes riding up and takes me away, or suddenly you find that the podcast is not available to you, think about why. It's because we're speaking out.
Well, if they come for you, they'll definitely be coming for me next, Dr. Weaver.
Yes, for all of us. It's important to remember not every accusation is proven, not every arrest is illegal, but there's a documented pattern of courts, watchdogs, journalists, and civil rights groups of all kinds raising concerns.
Historically, there have been allegations and documented cases of U.S. citizens being wrongfully targeted or detained by immigration authorities. The Cato Institute estimated that from 2006 to 2017, ICE wrongfully placed detainers on at least 3,506 U.S. citizens in Texas alone, just in Texas, based on its analysis of Texas data. There have been reports of innocent people detained by ICE suffering harm, including death, while under ICE detention.
And more recently, ProPublica reported that immigration agents had held more than 170 Americans against their will, while noting that counting such cases is difficult because the government has not consistently tracked them.
Now, that, Dr. Deneen, is the part that breaks through the idea that this only happens to undocumented people. If citizens can be wrongfully detained, then the safeguards are not only immigrant protections, they're protections for everyone.
So, wrongful detention is not new, but what seems to have changed recently is the scale and the intensity and some of the other things separating children from families, et cetera, et cetera.
Reuters reported in February of this year that federal courts had ruled more than 4,400 times since October that ICE was detaining immigrants unlawfully, and that more than 20,000 detainee lawsuits had been filed seeking release.
Whoa, that is a staggering number. This is supposed to be a democratic republic.
It's
Uh,
It certainly is a staggering number, and it suggests not just isolated mistakes, but a major clash between immigration enforcement policy and judicial review.
Reuters also reported cases in which judges found a lack of evidence supporting detention, including rulings noting no warrant or insufficient legal basis.
That matters because in a free society, law enforcement cannot be based simply on suspicion, accent, appearance, ethnicity, political pressure, or worse, numerical targets.
And when people see enforcement that appears to target appearance, language, or neighborhood, then it teaches a very dangerous lesson that some people have rights in theory, but not in practice. And that is not okay.
No, it's not. That particular issue that you're talking about, Chandler, that happened and gave a great boost to civil rights issues because there was the very famous case of the man, a black man, oh my, who was running. He was jogging in a jogging suit through a neighborhood, and he was arrested and detained with no evidence of anything else. Nothing else.
Yeah.
And it became a very big issue. I don't know if you remember that, but
Oh, yes, I do remember that very well, actually.
and it forced some changes in laws and law enforcement. So when enforcement becomes quota driven or politically pressured or directed, officers may feel pushed to arrest first and justify later.
which is very dangerous because the person detained may lose a job, be separated from their children, miss medication damaging their health, lose housing, or even be deported before the courts can correct the mistake.
Yeah, and this is where democratic rights deteriorate. A right that cannot be used in time is not a meaningful right. Due process after irreversible harm is not full due process. Get it?
Right.
So let's answer a direct question. Have deportations increased or decreased? This is a little bit more complicated than it might sound.
The top line answer is they increased in fiscal year 2025 compared with fiscal year 2024, but they still fell far short of the administration's stated goal of 1 million deportations per year.
Yeah. Now, see, there's an issue with this too. Why did they have set a goal to deport all these million people? Why is that the thing? Why would they set a quota like that? It sounds like they're telling the officers, you got to do this many. It doesn't sound right. Deport people, deal with people legally under legal conditions, not because you're meeting a quota. Reuters reported that ICE deportations rose to about 443,000. 443,000 in fiscal year 2025, up from about 271,000 a year earlier, based on agency budget documents. Axios reported a similar figure, 442,637 deportations between October 2024 and September 2025, about 171,000 more than the previous fiscal year.
But there is a complication. Fiscal year 2025 includes the final months of President Biden's term and most of President Trump's first year back in office. So the number is higher, but it is not a clean Trump only annual number.
And that's very important here, Dr. Deneen, because political messaging usually wants just a simple number, but public policy numbers can hide timing, legal categories, and administrative delays.
And Track, a nonpartisan immigration data research project, looked at the Trump administration portion of removals and found that removals through mid November 2025 were only about 7% higher than federal year 2024, despite the administration's much larger enforcement push. I think we're talking here about underreporting, actually.
So the answer depends on what you compare. Compared with the previous fiscal year, the deportation total rose. Compared with the administration's promise of 1 million a year, it was far below the target. Compared with the enormous increase in arrests, funding, and rhetoric, the increase was more modest than many expected.
Yeah. And once again, I object. I object to saying we're going to deport 1 million people. I mean, maybe, but maybe not. And, it should be based on what was done wrong rather than anything else. It's an important distinction that you make, though, Dr. Deneen. Arrests and detentions can arise faster than deportations because deportation requires legal process sometimes, although we've seen that uh, not happen. Transportation, receiving country cooperation, court orders, and paperwork.
Dr. Weaver, if you don't mind, real quick, I'd like to touch on a point that you made earlier. You said that for deportations, we should look at wrongdoings above anything else.
Yes.
I'm sad to say that I do agree with you, but I'm sad to say that if we just looked at the wrongdoings, the deportation numbers would go down like you
Yes.
wouldn't believe.
I believe you.
So that means people may be detained in large numbers even when they're not quickly deported. So the social harm can rise even if the deportation numbers don't rise as dramatically.
Another key question here. Are people being detained mostly serious criminals? Is that the case? Is that what's happening?
The answer is more complicated than political slogans suggest. Reuters reported that ICE detentions of people with no other criminal charges or convictions rose sharply, from about 860 when Trump took office to 24,500 by February 2026.
Yeah. And just a quick note, I know some immigrants with no criminal history, no criminal background, educated people that ran into problems. More about that in a different podcast, though. Track also reported that by November 2025, nearly three-quarters of people in ICE detention have never been convicted of a criminal crime. Let me reemphasize that. Three-quarters of the people in ICE detention had never been convicted of any criminal offense.
Now, that right there, Dr. Weaver, is something to think about. And it challenges what many people are told. The public hears that enforcement's focused on violent criminals. But if most detained people have no criminal conviction, then the reality is much broader than the slogan.
This does not mean all of those people had legal permission to remain in the United States.
No.
But it does challenge the public message that enforcement is focused mainly on the most dangerous offenders.
It suggests that the net has widened, but there's another aspect here, too, that just tells us that this is political and not law enforcement. When a clearly one of the great drug traffickers that was operating in the United States, who was convicted, was pardoned by our president. That raises some questions to me.
It certainly does. And another thing to remember is when the net widens, the risk of error widens with it.
From a democratic rights standpoint, broad enforcement nets are always dangerous. They increase the likelihood that people with valid claims, pending cases, legal status, or citizenship, citizens, will be swept into detention.
Oh, how beautiful there, Dr. Weaver. Because when that happens, communities learn to avoid institutions, police, courts, hospitals, schools, and public services. Now, I'm going to tell you, that is not healthy for democracy. As a matter of fact, it can be very fatal.
Indeed. Now let's address deporting people to the wrong place or deporting them without strong evidence.
There are documented cases and policies raising serious concern. One of the most visible was Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Maryland resident who was wrongly deported to El Salvador despite a 2019 court order specifically barring removal to that country. The Trump administration later acknowledged an error, and the case became a symbol of wrongful deportation and the failure of due process.
Whoa, okay, there's a shocker. The administration actually owned up to an error. Okay, wow. That is exactly the kind of case that makes people ask, well, if a court order does not stop the government, then what does? What does, Dr. Weaver?
Good question. And I don't have the answer under the present circumstances. There were also deportations of Venezuelans to El Salvador under gang related allegations. Allegations, not proof, with litigation over whether people received due process and whether the government relied on adequate evidence. Reuters reported that the administration deported more than 200 alleged gang members despite a court order temporarily blocking the use of the Alien Enemies Act. A court order was just, oh, no, we're not going to follow that.
An Associated Press reported that the federal judge ruled the administration's policy of deporting immigrants to so-called third countries, countries to which they had no ties, was unlawful, although the case had already been through emergency Supreme Court proceedings and was subject to appeal.
Reuters also reported on an ICE memo saying immigrants could be deported to countries other than their own with as little as 6 hours notice. 6 hour notice in some circumstances.
So has there been an increase in wrong place deportations?
We've got to be careful here. There's not a reliable public data set that counts wrongful deportations or wrong country deportations year by year. It's just not available. And guess what? The very people that we're trying to deal with here, the agencies, are the ones that would report that or wouldn't report it. Interesting, huh?
But we can say this: third country deportations have expanded. High profile, mistaken, or legally contested deportations have become more visible, and courts have been increasingly involved in reviewing whether people were removed without adequate process or to countries where they had no meaningful connection.
Yeah, that is the responsible wording, Dr. Deneen.
And from a youth perspective, the emotional issue is simple. Being sent to a country you barely know or where you may face danger is not just paperwork, it's traumatizing and life altering.
Hey, how about the fact that you might not even know the language that they speak, huh?
Absolutely. And wondering if you'll ever make it back.
You both are absolutely right. For the next section, let's step back a little from the legal details and look at the social impact. What does this do to society?
First, it creates fear in immigrant communities, not only among undocumented immigrants, but also among legal residents, asylum seekers, visa holders, green card holders, and even citizens who fear mistaken detention.
Yes, and that fear that you're talking about, it spreads, Dr. Weaver. Children may worry that a parent won't come home. Students may stop coming to school. Families may avoid clinics or public spaces or places where they actually need help. People may just stop asking for help altogether. And frankly, that scares the hell out of me.
Second, it also weakens trust in the police. If residents confuse local police with masked federal immigration agents, they may stop reporting crimes, avoid being witnesses, or hesitate to call emergency services.
And that hurts public safety.
It certainly does. Third, it pressures the courts. If tens of thousands of detainees file habeas petitions, then the immigration systems and the federal courts become overloaded.
Fourth, it affects families. Deportation is not just a legal event. It can remove a parent, a wage earner, a caregiver, or someone who has lived in the United States for decades.
It also shapes how young people understand citizenship. If they see rights applied unevenly, then they may begin to believe that democracy is more of a slogan than a lived reality.
That would be a tragedy. Fifth, it changes the meaning of law enforcement in a democratic society. When enforcement officers are masked, identification is unclear, warrants are disputed, and courts repeatedly find detentions unlawful, the issue becomes larger than immigration.
It becomes a question of constitutional culture.
Historically, democratic backsliding often involves the normalization of extraordinary state power. The public is told the power is necessary, temporary, or limited to unpopular groups, but as we've learned throughout history, once normalized, those practices can expand.
And psychologically, people adjust. Yeah. What would have shocked the public 10 years ago can become ordinary if it's repeated enough.
Now, Dr. Weaver, that is what worries my generation. It sure does worry me. We were growing up watching things become normal that should never have become normal at all.
You're quite right. Now, to be fair, we should also explain the argument in favor of ICE.
Yeah, supporters argue that a country must control its borders, enforce immigration law, remove people with final removal orders, investigate trafficking and smuggling, and protect communities from transnational crime. Sounds reasonable.
They also argue that ICE agents face threats, harassment, doxing, protests, and sometimes even violence. That's the argument for masking and stronger protection of agents.
And Dr. Deneen, those concerns should not be dismissed. No public employee should be threatened or targeted. Agent safety matters.
And there are real criminal cases involving trafficking, exploitation, drugs, money laundering, forced labor, and people who should not remain in the country after serious criminal convictions, like by a court.
So the question is not whether enforcement should exist.
The question is whether enforcement is lawful, evidence based, proportionate, transparent, and accountable.
And that distinction right there matters, Dr. Weaver. You can support law enforcement and still oppose lawless enforcement.
Exactly. In a democracy, the government cannot defend the rule of law by violating the rule of law.
At its core, democracy depends on something more than power. It depends on accountable power.
If ICE agents are well trained, clearly identified, properly supervised, and operating with warrants and evidence, then enforcement has legitimacy, and I would support that.
But if agents are rushed through training, poorly vetted, masked, using questionable evidence, or detaining people unlawfully, legitimacy erodes.
And once legitimacy erodes, people do not just distrust ICE, they distrust courts, police, elected officials, and the idea that their rights will actually protect them.
And that erosion does not only affect immigrants, no, it affects citizens, it affects police departments, courts, and the public trust in government itself.
There's an old principle in law: the stronger the government's power, the stronger the safeguards must be.
That principle is especially important when the power involved is the power to detain, separate families, and remove the person from the country.
Because if the government can remove someone without meaningful due process, then rights become fragile. They become something you have only if the system chooses to honor them.
And that is the core concern. Democratic rights do not disappear only when constitutions are rewritten. Mm-mm. They also deteriorate when enforcement outpaces accountability.
ICE began after 9/11 as part of a national security reorganization. Its official mission includes enforcing immigration, customs, trade, and border related laws.
But over time, especially in the deportations and detention side of the agency, ICE has become one of the most controversial law enforcement bodies in the United States.
And for younger Americans, ICE has also become a symbol of a larger question: whether government power is still limited by rights, courts, evidence, and public accountability.
Recent concerns involve shortened training, rapid hiring, masking, weaker transparency, allegations of excessive force, unlawful detention, wrongful deportation, and removals to third countries.
Deportations have increased compared with the prior fiscal year, but not nearly to the 1 million per year level promised by the administration, which I just find that so questionable anyhow. At the same time, arrests and detentions, especially of people without criminal convictions, have risen quite sharply.
And the central issue is not whether immigration law should exist. That's obvious. The central issue is whether the government can enforce that law without violating the law itself.
Yeah, that is the challenge. A nation can have borders and still require due process. It can enforce immigration law and still demand evidence. Still demand evidence. Right. It can protect officers and still require identification. It can remove people unlawfully present and still prevent wrongful detention.
Yes, sir. And a democracy can only remain a democracy if rights apply when they are inconvenient, not just when they're popular.
Because once the government is allowed to act without evidence, without visibility, and without consequences, the danger is not limited to immigrants.
It becomes a danger to the rule of law.
And to the future of democratic rights.
Well, we could go on forever, folks, but this is a very serious issue, and I hope you understand it a little better due to our work here. For things you don't know, I'm Sean Denis.
And I'm Chandler Foster.
And we ask you to please like, subscribe, comment, and return for more challenging and interesting topics. Goodbye for now.